we're between you and leaving on a Sunday afternoon. So we wanted to spend a couple minutes to talk about research process and the like. And I sit up here as a classicist. We had a bunch of engineers up here earlier. I'm a classicist, but I always go back to Dr. Seuss when I want to quote. And Dr. Seuss says, think left and think right, think low and think high. Oh, the things you can think up if only you try. And what research really is thinking up new ideas. We are, at this point in time, from my perspective, in an auditing renaissance. We spent the last 35 years wandering around in the woods because we spent the 80s talking about how to account for business combinations and LBOs. We spent the 90s talking about restructuring. We stumbled around the early 2000s talking about internal controls and not really understanding it. And now we're at a point in time where everybody says we sort of know what the issues are that are out there, but we sure have to go back to 1980 to look at where research left off. Because a lot of the ideas that came up in 1980 are still relevant today, but you have 150 times the computing power to do those ideas that exist. So as we go through things today, and as we think about projects and processes, think about that factor. Now, as we go through research, we think about three different kinds of research. We think about archival research, and Sue here is going to be the czarina of archival research. I gave you that title, okay?
Much appreciated.
Okay. And we're going to do something on behavioral, and Jay's going to talk about behavioral. And there's also one facet called, I'll call it theory, that's out there that we have to deal with. And archival is difficult. Archival is difficult because of confidentiality issues that exist out with regard to data. And Sue, fortunately, will talk to us about public data. But archival research, people come to firms and ask for archival research. Most of the data we have is proprietary. It's client data. It's client data that's therefore confidential, and only with consent can that be shared. So you have to think about that as you think about archival work. When you get to behavioral situations, you're in a much better situation because you can go out to get subjects. And subjects do exist at the firms, and the firms are very interested in behavioral research as we go along the road. And lastly, when we come to theoretical issues, everything we talk about, you listen to every single panel are revolving around 4 or 5 key issues. They come up in inspections, they come up in proposals, they come up everywhere. Materiality, group audits, internal control, accounting estimates, data analytics. That's what you'll hear again and again. Reflect on what you heard today. So with that being said, let's go to Sue. And we have Chris Dinkel on my right, who is my compatriot on the RAB, who's going to add some views from the practice side as we go through here. So, Sue, you've done a number of research studies on archival information. And one was commissioned by the government to some degree, and one was commissioned by the RAB. Want to talk about those?
Well, so first I want to say that I think the main reason I'm supposed to be here is to explain how wonderful it is to work with the RAB and do work for the CAQ. And I'd like to say that I have not been paid for these comments, that everything I will say about how genuinely pleasurable this experience has been is absolutely true. And so these 2 studies that Dan refers to have both been on restatements, and one of them was for the US Treasury Department, and then one was for the CAQ. It was a follow-on study on trends in restatements over the years. And the first, for the Treasury Department, they were very hands-off. They did not want to put their finger on any scale. They did not want to weigh in on any of the preliminary findings. It was a rather lonely experience. Fortunately, I had Zovana there as sort of a shadow companion to give me some useful insights about where they might be coming from. It was what it was, and I think, again, I only used public data sources, and some of them were just developing at the time, so we were learning a lot about the data as we were doing the project. But then I got to this project for the CAQ, and the CAQ came equipped with a whole panel of people to help me understand the data. So I would have hours of time when Zovana, Ira, and Bob would give feedback on what I was doing, but also to speak with partners who could explain to me what a little r meant to them as opposed to a big R. I mean, we had talked about theory. We had hours of discussion over the theory behind a revision and a restatement, and how that was, importantly, how that was reported out in the public data sets. Because a lot of times you get audit analytics, which we all use, and there's a field, and you download the field and put a 0 or 1 and run your analyses. Well, that's kind of wrong in many situations. There's several fields in audit analytics that the label is just wrong, and I yet see people use it that way all the time, but they don't know that because they haven't spent all this time with these very interested, engaged, and thoughtful members of the RAB who could say, well, why don't you send me an example of what exactly the underlying document is and how that's being classified by audit analytics. So, I mean, walking through individual examples, debating what the difference is, how they should be classified, invaluable experience for me, and has informed many of my papers far beyond that particular project.
And I think it was very informative, Sue, for us to be in that discussion with you, because we learned amongst ourselves what was happening with audit analytics and how good or how bad that data was, and it gave rise to us questioning some of the data that audit analytics was producing along the way. So, one of the things you dealt with was you ended up putting a timeline in your paper. Can you want to explain that and how that came about?
So the timeline is looking at how restatements have responded to events in the regulatory world, responses of the practitioners. So when SAB 99 came out, what does that do? And when, of course, SOX came out, what did that do? And the study it didn't try to be the sort of study that said, from this point in time to this point in time, we can explain everything because, AS5 was introduced. It was much more of let's keep in mind, as we look at this data, of all of the economic, regulatory, and practice events that were going on behind the scenes. So it's more of an idea of keeping the larger world in mind as we looked through these trends and restatements. And one of the things that really brought home to me, and I think this is rather what Dan was saying when we need to think back in time, is that we like to think of ourselves as scientists, and we like to think of ourselves as, we read the data and we know things. Well, accounting is very much in evolution at all times. And so now I look at papers sometimes that I'm reviewing or editing, and it says, we know. And I think, we knew that's how things were, but can we really say that going forward, that this is what we know, and can we rely on that? Because we have so many changes in the world of accounting. And I think we too often don't look back at how things were and consider the fact that we might need to revisit some of those things that we thought we knew, because from the time I did the first study to the time I did the second study, things that I thought I knew the first study were entirely wrong because the firms had reacted in part to some of the information that was in the world because of the first study. So I think another example of the value of using the RAB is that you get this sense of how the reactions of the firms have maybe changed what we thought we knew about the way things really work.
Now, when you think about the archival study you did, Sue, it was based on publicly available data. Were there other data sets you were using along the way?
Not really. So one of the biggest problems in doing restatement data is that everyone wants to know how many of the restatements are due to fraud. And of course, that is in some archival way unknowable because we don't have a good database to measure intent. So we did reach out to some of the people here in this audience who had databases that looked more intently at fraud and tried to incorporate that. It is inherently a limitation of archival studies in many ways that you can't get behind the scenes to what people are really thinking when they do things. But at the same time, it was very useful to understand, again, have that robust discussion about what fraud means when you're an auditor versus a researcher.
Did you end up, I'm an old guy, so I remember 1979, 1980 event studies. Did you think about crisp data in dealing with reactions to the restatements, or was that problematic also?
Well, yeah, we did that. We did the market reactions.
Yeah.
Market reactions, I think many people who do archival studies understand the limitations of those. But it does give an example. I think the prior panel was mentioned, if you do restate and the market doesn't care, is that a material problem? Clearly the data suggests that restatements these days are generally not very material. Only a few manage to move the markets anymore, which is a really big change from prior years. And I still see papers that come in all the time saying, the market reacts strongly to all restatements. And I think, wow, no, it doesn't. Have you followed what's been going on?
One of the things that I've always been contemplating and wanting to do is we've had this discussion about materiality today. And when we think about materiality, it is what moves the needle relative to stock price. How does an investor react to a change in expectations? And how can you map a change in expectations so you understand what truly is material to investors, so you can understand when you set materiality how a stock price might move if you miss earnings by 1.2% as opposed to 1.5%, or if revenues are off by X or Y. So that's another archival study that might be done with a whole bunch of different variables when I think about it. One of the things that we had a lot of footnotes in that study, didn't we, Sue?
We sure did.
And did we talk about ICFR in there?
We did. In fact, that was an interesting development because originally ICFR and the relationship between ICFR and restatements was supposed to be a larger part of the study than it ended up being, partly because when we got to that part of the results, they were very puzzling. They were puzzling to me. They were puzzling to the people on the RAB. For example, a lot of people were very confounded that there were a lot of restatements that did not have any material weakness reported prior to the restatement. And there was consternation. We should have predicted the restatement. And I thought, well, if you knew there was a problem, then there shouldn't have been a restatement. So I had the opposite expectation. You shouldn't have known there were a problem and then let there be a restatement. So we never really found a common ground on exactly what that meant. And then we also had a strange finding where the companies that were not subject to the 404B reports tended to report more material weaknesses. So if the auditor wasn't there, then you would get more material weaknesses reported. So in the end, it ended up identifying so many more research questions than answers. And I really encourage the CAQ to pick that up with, I thought Chris Hogan would be the perfect person to do a commission study on really understanding this, not my area of expertise, but it really brought to mind how important it is to work with the people who really know that data set, because once I learned so much about the restatements and I turned to the ICFR where I wasn't as deeply immersed, it became much more difficult to make real sense of what I was getting from the data.
So Chris, from a practitioner's perspective in ICFR, questions you ask, things you'd want answered?
Yeah, I think there were a couple of things, as to your point, Sue, that were footnoted in the study. And one that I found interesting was the point you just made. And when you looked at the percentage of material weaknesses disclosed in advance of restatements, you saw a higher percentage with the 404A companies than you did 404B. And you asked the question, well, why does that make sense? Is it because they're smaller companies? Perhaps they have a less sophisticated internal control environment? Or could it be something along the lines that maybe there's a propensity at the smaller companies that they perceive less of a market reaction, so there might be a greater propensity to disclose material weaknesses? Don't know. You know, it's interesting because in those cases, you know, the auditor is not required to opine on ICFR, and I think one of the things that would be interesting from a research perspective is to understand who identified the material weakness. Was it management? Or was it the auditor? And I say the auditor, albeit we're not opining on ICFR, we have a responsibility to understand ICFR. And as we go through that process and understand ICFR, if we find and identify a material weakness, we have the obligation to communicate it to those charged with governance. So, you know, it's interesting, albeit the opinion is not there, who identified that material weakness? Was it management? Was it the auditor? And I think the second piece to that is, what is the relationship between the reported material weakness and the root cause for the accounting issue that resulted in the restatement? I think there's a fertile ground for research there of doing some analysis as to the correlation and the nature of the disclosed material weakness to the underlying root cause of the restatement.
Now, I will say that data isn't publicly available. So again, we're kind of in a situation where the things you'd like to know, we would actually have to have your input.
Correct.
To do that. That might be something the CAQ and RAB could facilitate.
And that brings up the issues that we have about what's confidential data and what's not confidential data, and what can be shared and what can't be shared. You know, one of the things that we also were talking about yesterday was the one place where there's good data that exists, but there's also confidentiality concerns, is at the PCOB, and also at the AICPA from the inspection process. And the PCOB does have a program that allows academics to come in with boundaries and look at that data and conduct academic research on that data. It's certainly subject to confidentiality concerns, but it is an absolutely fertile ground for looking at causality and having insights into things that don't appear anywhere else. The AICPA also has announced that they have a research program out there that will make peer review data available in some way, shape, or form. And the same sort of confidentiality concerns pervade there also, but that also provides a vehicle where academics may be able to do archival work in some sort of sandbox. So those are all good archival opportunities that exist out there. And whatever we can do to do that, let's do it. When you look to the firms on data and archival data, usually you have to go micro, and you have to go client by client, get client permission to do something, and conduct studies on that specific entity, because that's where you could explore data analytics with large populations, but in a micro environment. But now moving from archival data to behavioral data, okay? Jay and his colleagues, which were Jeff and Jennifer and Greg, had come up with a study on internal controls that they got a grant for.
Yes.
And they worked with Jim Dolliner and myself with a number of meetings to deal with things. And Chris was party to another research project with regard to Tim Brown and his team, which included Chris and Ryan and Elder. And so what I want to do is just ask a couple of you questions around that interaction. So Jay, why don't you just talk about what happened in that, what journey we all took?
Yeah, journey is a good word. I kind of look back at that time. It was really a voyage of discovery for our team. We set out to study the most difficult judgments in the internal control of our financial reporting audit. And we certainly went into the whole process with some perspective on how these judgments were being made, but that was driven primarily by what we were reading from the professional standards. And we really lacked insight as to what was really happening, around these very, very difficult judgments. And we really had the great pleasure of working with Jim Dolinar and also Dan Sunderland to have the opportunity, and it really was a pleasure working with these gentlemen to just learn more about exactly what was happening in the field, which we thought was really going to help to formulate specifically what we were going to focus on in our research. And what I found very, very interesting and very encouraging was how these colleagues that clearly were very, very busy on the Research Advisory Board were very willing to communicate with us, to take significant amount of time with us to help us better understand these judgments, because they really had a desire for us to go ahead and move forward with a qualitative study that was going to yield the most possible benefits both to research and also ultimately perhaps the classroom. And just to give an example, I remember, Dan, when you joined us on campus at Bentley University, and Dan spent the better part of the day with our entire team. The team went in and we talked specifically about the direction we were planning to take. And Dan really gave us some very specific examples of situations that occurred. So a couple of the videos, for example, that we just watched really resonated, and really some of that knowledge came out that day. And I found that to be one of the more exciting research days that I can think of. It was a fun day. And
Exciting.
It was about as exciting as it gets, right? It was. But by the end of the day, I thought it really became clear that the judgment that we really wanted to focus on was when a deficiency was discovered, what process did the audit professional have to go through to determine whether that was a significant deficiency, and then whether that ultimately was a material weakness. And aspects like management review controls became prominent and became very, very important. And as a result of that meeting, we were able to then formulate our semi-structured questions in a way that really was going to yield the most possible benefit for our research. And it just really it worked out really, really well. And I guess when I look back at that day, and I've often talked about how I always thought that we could look at the medicine field or medical field and think about the productive collaboration that happens between clinical practitioners and researchers. And why can't we have that same kind of collaboration to help us as audit researchers formulate our research agendas? Right, so it works in medicine, where the problems of clinical practice can help to drive the agenda, and why can't that happen, for auditors? And frankly, I look back at that day, and it makes me realize that it can happen, which I found very encouraging. And I think really that's what the CAQ grant program is about, to bring together top leaders in the profession with researchers on very, very important topics for purposes of trying to yield the most benefits for everyone involved. So I found it to be a very fruitful endeavor.
Thanks, Jay. Chris, you had a project also, and that involved error detection and auditor involvement and then evaluation of weaknesses. You want to describe it and what happened during that process?
Sure. I had the pleasure of working with Tim Brown and his team. I think Chris is somewhere out there. Great experience. This one came in for funding. They had their hypotheses, their manipulation variables put together, but we're still in the process of trying to build out the instrument. And it was, the premise was putting together a very realistic scenario of when an auditor identifies there is an error coming out of their substantive testing, and they have to deal with the implications of the control deficiency. And what was critical in all this was making sure that we put together something that was as practical and real as to what a participant would see in practice today. So I got assigned to that. I did an initial 90-minute call with the team. They took me through what their goals, their objectives were, from a behavioral standpoint, their hypotheses, what they were looking to get out of this. And they had several specific questions for me from a practice standpoint, which was, we need to get to a certain spot in order for this to work. And that spot was, the conclusion can't be simple. It can't be straightforward that it's a control deficiency. It can't be straightforward it's a material weakness. There has to be an element of judgment and uncertainty, so when we go to manipulate it, we're not getting false positives. And the manipulation variables were two. It was, how does the level of cooperation from the client ultimately influence that judgment call? And number two, if the client was willing to correct the error, would that have an impact on how the auditor or participant would view the ultimate conclusion as to the severity of the deficiency? So what was critically important was making sure, as we put together the instrument and the fact pattern, it had to leave some bit of judgment and doubt based on the facts as to what the conclusion was. Absent that, again, you get a bunch of false positives as far as the responses. So I was able to give them some suggestions as to how I thought they could strengthen that, make it more realistic, add that level of judgment based on what we see in practice today. And one of the things that was interesting is, I think one, maybe two of the researchers had public accounting experience, but it was somewhat dated. And you think about the pace of change that we've had over the last several years. They wanted to make sure they were as current as they could be as to what we experience today, again, to bring that element of realness to it to help enhance the responses. So I was able to provide that practice perspective to them. They went back, expanded their review of the literature, made some changes to the instrument, and went forward.
Thanks, Chris. And I think Chris really displays how we can add value. We're very interested in the questions you all have. We wouldn't be involved in this if we weren't. And the one thing we have is real life experience, unfortunately, on some of these things. And we've had to wend through these issues, and always when you have to look at something for 5 straight days for 24 hours a day, you tend to think about nuances that you didn't think about if you were just looking at for a minute or two. So I think that's such a valuable contribution that you made, Chris, to that study. Jay, you know, one of the things that we talk about is identifying who and what level of staff or professionals should be used. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. We actually went into the project thinking that we were going to want to have these semi-structured interviews with seniors, managers, and partners. But really, after the day that we spent with Dan, it became very, very clear that the person that we really needed to focus on were the engagement partners that actually had experience with these very, very difficult, consequential judgments in the audit of internal controls. So that really was the conclusion that we reached, and it was a pretty straightforward conclusion after working together that day. And I think what I found very, very encouraging is we reached that conclusion. We knew that was the best course of action for the research. We talked about that with you, and then we talked about that with Margot. And frankly, the CAQ said, absolutely, that's what we're going to do. So I think for those colleagues that are contemplating working with the CAQ, our experience was that once we determined that this was the right target group, you know, the CAQ was very, very happy to work with us in making sure that they supplied the professionals that we needed to complete these research protocols. Now, there were some challenges, to be sure. We needed to make sure the anonymity of the colleague, the anonymity of the firm. It was a pretty long questionnaire, so we estimated about 45 minutes to an hour to complete it. You know, of course, these colleagues were all over the country. The researchers were all over the country. One thing the CAQ definitely insisted on is that we couldn't tape the interviews. And so there was definitely some conversations that we had to have to figure this out. And in the end, we decided to have 2 research assistants basically go ahead and transcribe each of the interviews, and that worked out very well. And then they immediately reached correspondence on that. And then the CAQ arranged for conference calls, which included the researchers and the participant, and of course it was done on an anonymous basis, and everything worked out just fine. So frankly, the CAQ delivered on their promise, exactly like they said they would, so worked out well.
Good. Hey, Chris, in terms of your ongoing interaction, I want to describe, you know, the initial calls and all that, but what's happened since then?
Yeah, there were a series of subsequent calls with the research team after the initial call. As they went back and refined and developed their instrument, they came back to me and said, we have some more questions, can you take a look at this again? Went through that process. As they revised it, it came back another time. Again, all with the same goal of trying to get the most realistic scenario together to get the most credibility in the results. So there were a series of calls that I had with the research team. One of the important things that I think came out of this, Dan, was I think initially the research team was thinking that it would be senior associates, so professionals with 3 to 5 years of experience who would be the participants in the study. And as we worked through it and thought about it, and you think about the level of judgment that would be involved in making this conclusion, we ultimately determined that having manager level resources do it would probably get better results, just because it's probably more consistent with who's actually making those judgment calls in practice. So there was a series of ongoing communications and discussions as we worked together and when they ultimately finalized that instrument.
One of the things that we think about, or you all should be assured of, is we're here to help have the research progress. The results are the results. We're not biased. The results are going to be what they're going to be. That's what research is supposed to be. And that's something everybody should understand along the way. I want to take just a couple minutes to talk about the data collection protocol for a second. Then Chris is going to speak briefly to the process for accepting proposals. The wonderful thing about this process, both the grant process and also the access to auditors, is what's happened is these research proposals have been subject to scrutiny by both academics and practitioners. Everybody's worked and come to conclusions that these are good and useful for the profession. And with that in mind, the firms believe generally that they will support these studies, and they will canvass the entire country to make sure that the appropriate participants are part of the study. And I contrast that to the friends and family things that come into the firms all along the way. We don't mean to discourage those things, but they are not subject to a detailed review process by practitioners and by academics. They also may or may not have been vetted other places. If they come in, usually we have a partner sponsor them in a local office, and you'll have local office participants if we think it's okay. But that's much more discretionary. The things running through the RAB are very important, and they're things we want to participate in. And the data collection is timely, and we have people at each of the firms that are dedicated to pulling together things in an appropriate fashion. Chris, do you want to walk through the process of getting grants and access to personnel?
Sure. So the request for funding through the RAB is a competitive process, and as those proposals come through, it's really a two-round review process that it goes through with the RAB. Round one is the initial review by a team of 2. Again, it'd be a firm rep and an academic who would look at the request for money, so the amount of funds, the nature of the study, the benefits to practice, the benefits to research, and ultimately making the conclusion, are we going to put that forward to the second round of review? If it goes through to that second and final round of review, that proposal is reviewed by the full RAB, so all the academics, all the practitioners on the RAB. That goes through a very rigorous discussion process, lots of debate as to whether we're going to approve that study for funding. So it's a very competitive, very rigorous process that's discussed in detail at the full level.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So we're starting to run out of time here. I'm looking for closing thoughts. Sue, maybe I'll start with you in terms of thoughts about the RAB process, thoughts about archival research, general considerations.
Well, go archival. So I think that perhaps some archival researchers may feel that the RAB doesn't have as much to offer them, because really you have to get your data the way you usually get your data. They can't offer proprietary data when you're not looking for subjects, but to really have that dedicated attention of people thinking about what you're doing, thinking about the data you're using, giving you feedback on how you're interpreting your results. Does it make sense? Does it fit with what's really happening in their world, or at least the world as it existed when your data was collected? It's not only very valuable, it's just very interesting, and it really made me a much better accountant, auditor, and researcher. And again, I've taken that with me, and it's informed my research ever since. And if I ever had the chance to do it again, I would take it in a second.
We'd love to do it with you. Chris, some thoughts?
I would say keep the proposals coming. Obviously, we're here to help. There's a lot of resources that can help. I can tell you from a practice partner perspective, it's a very different way of thinking about auditing from a research perspective, from an academic perspective, than what I do on a day-to-day basis. And it's a very different and rewarding way for me to think. So keep the proposals coming. There's lots of resources to help once they get in.
Thanks. Jay?
Yeah, I would say the benefits of working with the CAQ are clear. You have access to a colleague like Dan Sunderland to really think about what your research ultimately is going to mean to practice. And going the friends and family route is just really, really hard to accomplish the sample, or be able to get the audit professionals that you need to fill your samples, in particular when you're dealing with folks at higher levels like managers and partners. So I think there's just a lot of benefits to working with the CAQ, and I appreciate the programs that are in place.
Well, this has been a wonderful opportunity for me, and I think that the RAB and the CAQ interaction is just great. I've gotten to work with people like Chris and with Sue and Jay, and this is what I'm in the profession for. There is so much that can be done on a research level right now, and we really are in a renaissance. And this is the point in time when it's so important that we all work together, the regulators, the practitioners, the academics, to make audits the way they should be. Make them quality, make them effective, make them efficient. And there's so much that lays ahead of us. So with that being said, thank you so much for the time you guys spent, and I'll pass it on to Tim, I think.
Pleasure.